So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for being here today. Welcome to another event hosted by the Language Collaboratory, which is a partnership for the advancement of intercollegiate dialogue on the teaching of languages and cultures, and is driven by the language centers and institutes at the University of Iowa, University of Michigan, University of Minnesota, Michigan State University, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Our aim is to provide collaborative professional development opportunities for educators of language, culture, and literature at the 5 institutions. Our series this fall addresses perennial issues of accessibility, inclusivity, and learner autonomy and agency through the lens of our current shared circumstances, and approaches these issues from a variety of perspectives, building on the expertise of individuals on our own campuses. We aim to share insights and to encourage interinstitutional dialogue, bridging the institutional distance and fostering a collaborative interchange of ideas. You are invited to contribute to what we hope will be a lively discussion. The sessions will be recorded and made available through each institution's website. We ask that you mute your microphone at the outset, that you use the tools in Zoom to contribute questions and comments in the chat, and during the open discussion period to raise your hand virtually prior to activating your microphone. Closed captioning will be available in just a minute through the live transcript button in the Zoom menu bar. Hang on. I'll have to do that when I stop sharing the screen, sorry. Before we start today's discussion, just a reminder that the next event will be held a week from Thursday at this time, hosted by the University of Iowa, the Center for Language and Culture Learning, and will be focused on inclusivity with respect to the LGBTQ identities and queer inclusive practices in the classroom. Today's discussion comes to us from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and will be led by Jana Martin from the Language Institute at Wisconsin. Jana, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dan. So as Dan mentioned, I work at the Language Institute at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm the Associate Director. It is my pleasure to introduce today Dr. Jennifer Gipson. She received her PhD at the University of California at Berkeley, and is currently assistant professor of French and also folklore affiliate at UW-Madison. Her research interests include literature and folklore in 19th century France, French in the United States, global Black studies, especially Creoles of color in New Orleans and abroad. She is a frequent presenter for online and blended instructional design topics, especially regarding accessibility and inclusion. She has been a guest instructor for the UW's Teach Online at UW program, a speaker at national and international EdTech conferences, and holds micro-credentials from Quality Matters and the Online Learning Consortium. As the recipient of an Educational Innovation Small Grant, she studied the affordances of annotation technology for teaching close reading online. She's also passionate about studying and developing best practices to leverage the affordances of synchronous and asynchronous technologies for delivering ethnic studies courses and courses dealing with race in digital environments. She's currently a consultant for the UW-Madison Division of Diversity, Equity, and Educational Achievement for online best practices and student success. Before we start, I would also like to mention that Dr. Gibson will be presenting on Wednesday at our UW-Madison's Diversity Forum. This is an institutional event. So for those of you who are interested from other campuses, you're welcome to join us. The event is open to everyone. And I'll put a link in the chat. So before we go into some guiding questions for today's discussion, Jennifer, what do you understand under inclusive practices in the context of language teaching and learning? And you're muted.
Working on, not anymore. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Inclusive practices, I think, mean recognizing first our own positionality, power, and paradigms in all aspects of our teaching. We don't just teach content, as my title, Design is Social Justice, gets at. We model civic responsibility, equity, and inclusion. And we model how thinking about technology impacts society, human interactions, and social justice. But within this, we could talk very broadly about inclusive practices, but I want to focus on what is already a broad topic, and I was pleased to learn a topic of Yada's dissertation research, questions. I want to think about those questions we ask students, especially those questions that students ask us, are scared to ask us, or might somehow be excluded or discouraged from asking us or each other, and how to make the act of asking and the dissemination of information that comes with it more equitable and inclusive for students, and at the same time, less time consuming for instructors with overflowing inboxes. I will treat content or course-related questions that can come up in any class, while if we have time, hopefully also talking about how discussions that might come up in more advanced language classes or intro to literature classes can be made more inclusive of diverse student perspectives through deliberate instructional design. And while I propose strategies to meet the remote moment we're in, I also suggest that there are pedagogical affordances that can complement any modality in which we may someday find ourselves. Hence, my alluding to asynchronous affordances for remote instruction and beyond. I wanted to point, as we get started, to one thing that came in email from TED Talks I get every week, as many of you will, about how to have more inclusive meetings over Zoom. And I can paste this link into the chat. But one of the quotes was, key information is less likely to be shared when it is already known by others. Lesser known but important information tends not to be broadly shared. And I think we, as instructors, have to think about who has that information capital in the classroom and who might not have it, and what the barriers are.
Right. Jennifer, how did you come upon this topic and this passion?
Well, how I came upon this topic of asking was basically out of necessity. I identify as a person with disabilities and as someone who has to ask about physical access on a repeated basis. Started thinking about how students feel asking for access that probably should have been there in the first place in many cases, or accommodation when that was genuinely needed. And through presenting things on instructional design about this and encouraging people to think about the student view button that exists in most learning management systems, to put yourself in student view of having to ask, and worse, ask again for things that you need, asking them of a busy professor at the start of the semester, having that be your first interaction. And from a belief that deficit models, what I call deficit models, obfuscate great possibilities. What does this mean? Disability as a deficit. So I'll refer, if any of you were in the last Language Collaboratory presentation on phonocentrism, deaf, or deaf with a capital D, as culture. What can signed language do that spoken ones can't? Thinking in those terms moves past the idea that this is something that needs to be fixed, thinking in terms of culture and affordances. I laughed out loud watching the documentary this summer, Crip Camp, that was executive produced by Barack and Michelle Obama, when they're interviewing someone who was in the 504 sit-ins in San Francisco in the 1970s, and the FBI cuts their phone lines. And the deaf people raise their hand and say, hey, we got this, and sign to each other in and out the windows over the FBI's. And this was the precursor to the Americans with Disability Act, of course. I think analogous, because disability can be thought of as generative, as a side of creativity, of doing things differently, sometimes things that no one else has thought about doing that way. Analogous is thinking about online teaching. And it's so often framed as a deficit. We're lamenting what we could be doing in a face-to-face classroom. We're trying to approximate face-to-face, which can get in the way of embracing the affordances that technology gives us to do things differently and often in ways we never imagined pedagogically possible, which to me is the pure magic of instructional design. Now, I do want to acknowledge there is a difference between emergency remote, in which there's a frantic need to move content online, and deliberately, expertly, carefully designed content in which I had the time to think very, very carefully about how I was going to structure things. And most of what I'm drawing from is from an intro to French literature class that was designed to be meet face-to-face once a week and have the rest be delivered online in a self-paced format where students could interact with each other, could ask me questions, but got to work at their own pace, check their understanding of text, and start some analysis. And I think necessity is often, as the proverb says, the mother of all invention. And this is certainly a time in which many of us are facing different necessities than we ever knew. So I'd like to encourage everyone to think about what's the good we can take from this and take forward. To that end, if I could, I'd ask participants to reflect quietly if you'd like, or if you would be willing to contribute to the chat. How has remote, or what format of learning you find yourself in, of content delivery you find yourself in, changed questions? Has it changed the quantity of questions you get, the content of questions? Is your email inbox overflowing? Are students more reticent in different ways than before to ask questions about different things? And if anybody happens to know whether your institution has Piazza, it's a tool generally used in high enrollment STEM classes, but I have found really nifty in language classes as a question management tool. And Yana has indicated that we're happy also for you to raise your hand and answer this so that we know where you stand on this topic. Mandy, do I have host privileges to call in someone?
Sure.
Okay.
So I don't know. I was thinking about this, and it's been a while since I had taught an undergraduate class. And so this is my first time teaching an undergraduate class in like 5 years. And so it's hard for me to compare the before and after. But one thing that has been really helpful to me this semester is I've been having them do little quizzes before they come to class each day. And the last question of that quiz is always the same, right? It's like either what did you not, like what is still unclear, or what do you not understand, and or like what questions has this raised for you, right? Like what interests or what ideas have been sparked for you. And that has been amazingly informative for me, right? It has really helped me just to see what the muddy points are for them. And I feel like the students feel free to ask those questions because they know it's just me, right? They don't have to voice this question in front of their whole peer cohort. And I think one of the things I've been proud about for my own teaching this semester is that I've then been able to, like, even though they're doing these shortly before class, bring those questions into the class and just say, so some of you asked in your, you know, like acknowledge those and bring them in so that they know that I'm reading those and that they're getting their questions answered. Because I figure, you know, and we all know this, if one has the question, oftentimes it's more than one that actually has it. So that has just been a really helpful tool for me to kind of get some of those questions from them.
Great, thank you. And that's actually a really great illustration of, I think, positionality and paradigms. You're putting yourself in what I was going to call a listening posture. You're asking the question. So this is what Yana rightly suggested should have actually been the title of my talk. Asking is not inclusive. Having a student need to ask me for disability accommodation does not feel good for the student, I assure you, because I do asking as a faculty member and it doesn't feel any better. I do asking all the time. Needing to ask for what you need doesn't feel good, but knowing that someone is listening is better, right? So we can't anticipate every need, and we cannot design for every need. Universal design is not, in fact, totally universal, but we can adopt the posture of asking a question so that we get answers to it and we don't put the onus on the student to need to ask. We have a question from the chat that I want to look at, but thank you so much, Mandy. Thinking of in-class questions, I find that camera on off, this is from the chat, has been a limiting factor for in-class questions. It's been a strange semester too, because even the chat won't light up, as I hope encourage model. Okay, so we're running into some technical difficulties here with the questions happening in class. One of the things I want to think about is how can we make asking questions in class better? And there we have a technical limitation, but also how can we make the questions that happen outside of class better? Are people seeing a lot of emails or more emails than you would normally see? Or a sense that maybe students are reticent to send the email right now? I'm going to, any answers there? I'm going to do a bit of screen sharing here and suggest, if you're not familiar with Piazza, I think it's a crowdsourced, class-sourced rather, tool that allows you to allow students to be anonymous to other students, anonymous to instructor. You decide exactly how this is going to work. And what happens is that if you have a really well-designed, what I call Unit 0, that how to use the class, which again assumes you had time to do this beforehand. This is a flow chart I have. It's an infographic. Obviously, to be accessible, you're going to need alt text and text explanations. But it's trying to make sure that students don't feel like they have to wait until class time to get an answer to a question, but also that the question doesn't have to rise to the level of needing to go straight to the instructor's inbox, right? Because there are questions that are worthy of the instructor's inbox, and there are questions that could be genuine concerns, but not need immediate professorial attention. And so Piazza is used in high enrollment classes, mostly in the sciences, I've found. I gave a presentation once called Humanists Have Questions Too, on how we could be using Piazza in the humanities. Yeah, because we do have questions. And it allows students to put a question out there anonymously if I choose to let them, allows other students to answer, allows me to endorse a student answer and say, yeah, this one's a good answer, or allows me to intervene and answer it myself as the instructor. And so that takes care, I think, of so many questions that come up in between. It empowers students so that a question that's not particular to their needs or confidential, they can see, oh, look, other students are answering me. Other students are telling me this is a good question. I'm not the only one with this question. But it also equalizes information so that everyone gets the same input from the professor. If I respond to the question or give a thumbs up to a student answer to say, hey, this is a good answer. And it streamlines my time because those questions don't end up in my inbox, not once, and especially not twice. And twice would indicate that a student hadn't gotten the information at the same time another one did. So I will stop the share there. And I do want to point out that I think Mandy gave a good example of what makes inclusion and what students need in your class a standing question. And one way to do that is at the end of self-assessments, or as you say, at the end of a quiz, and you're getting these great insights. I've had the same experience, but students anticipate there's going to be this check-in. So I have this safe space where I know I will have input. And I suggest that you tell the student, you're welcome to let me know before, but I'll follow up in 2 weeks about this accommodation. Find ways that asking doesn't have to be a de facto outing, no matter what the issue is, whether the student has difficulties at home, the student has a disability accommodation, the student has a pronoun preference besides she, he. Let students embrace things as an identity if they want to, but don't force it as a de facto, what I call outing, where asking becomes, you have to ask the professor to do something special, an act of outing. Some of you who have Canvas, your admins may have enabled pronoun selectors. That's something that you can check. It exists in Canvas, but your admins would have to enable it. And then there are still some different things to weigh there. Let's see, we have some questions coming in. A few of my classes have organized a class Snapchat that they use to communicate with each other, ask questions, etc. I think this is a great idea and encourage it, but as an instructor, I'm not included and I don't really know how it's used. Piazza seems like a tool that could at least give students another option, a way to include the instructor but pose a question anonymously. Absolutely. In the UW digital ecosystem, Piazza plugs in LTI into learning tool integration, plugs and plays with Canvas. I don't know anyone else's scenario, but it's a way for me to see, because it's important pedagogical information, what's not being understood. That's not a conversation I want to get left out of as a teacher, right? That's the valuable information. And so I would suggest if you don't have Piazza, in most learning management systems, you'll have the ability to pin a discussion forum at the top. And you might have a way to link to it on your landing page. You could make that, even if you can't make it anonymous, you can still make it a safe space where the assumption is you can ask a question and you might get peer input, or you might get, if it rises to the level of needing instructor input, you'll get instructor input and then set your alerts to be able to monitor that forum. is a workaround. To me, being excluded from that conversation as an instructor would be losing some really valuable pedagogical insight. I don't just need to answer the question. I need to know that that was a point that required a question, right?
Right. And thank you so much, Jennifer. We have only a few minutes left, so please feel free to raise your hand or put your questions in the chat. I do have a question for Jennifer in the meantime while you put your thoughts together. So Jennifer, you mentioned benefit to students in terms of equity and inclusion and fair dissemination of information, and also instructors in terms of time and rethinking how questions about a class or class content are handled. How does this work as instructor mailboxes or inboxes are overflowing and instructors are fielding questions that aren't familiar from the face-to-face classroom?
Oh, I think the best way for it to work is to go back in time to when your class started, to have a good orientation where you're telling students exactly how questions will be handled. But with Piazza, how it works is that I do get one alert to my email, but that students know the question has been asked, because that's where they're going. If they're about to ask the question, they go and see, oh yeah, and they just click, this is a good question too. So those are the logistics of that, providing students a flow chart that says, this is the kind of question that you shouldn't hesitate to send me personally by email. This is the kind of question that belongs here. This is the kind of question that belongs there, is helping to level the playing field by providing that information that's sometimes understood. And if we even think about first-generation college students, there's just not as much unspoken passage of information, some of which we don't realize happens if we don't think about this experience. And I think for language learners, it's very important to make clear what our expectations are, and do this again in your Unit 0. I don't really want a technical question or a genuine emergency sent to me in French, where the language is such that I can't really understand the meaning. Nor do I want the student to feel the pressure to write it in French in such a moment. So when do we need the questions to be in the target language? And try leveraging student-to-student questions as an affordance for collaboration, where students can throw out a question for classmate feedback, realize they're not the only ones with this question, and broaden what questions can be. The questions, if there's a peer-to-peer interaction, could be things that you wouldn't usually email the instructor, like, am I understanding this passage correctly? My theory of instructional design for languages is often called misunderstanding mitigation. We've all had that experience in a language class, probably, of vastly misunderstanding something, especially when we get into literary texts. And so we're thinking about ways that students could get information sooner, and when it matters, earlier on. You may or may not have annotation technologies through Hypothesis or press books on your campus, but it's social annotation. But looking at different ways to pin a discussion forum, even in a language class where you wouldn't use it to discuss in the target language, can be a way to ensure equitable dissemination of information in a remote environment and perhaps beyond.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, we have one comment here in the chat before we leave. Jeffrey's mentioning that he can't see student faces, and he can't see whether the students are frustrated or they are not understanding. So it's a very tough spot, you know, when instructors they can't see the students, and they're trying to encourage them, and they're trying to encourage the discussion.
And I find data extremely helpful in the asynchronous formats where you can see exactly how many students paused that video and rewound it. And the data dashboards that are now available that I piloted last year being useful. But in synchronous, not being able to see the tables have turned, in async, more challenging than asynchronous discussions. Yes, I would also suggest in asynchronous discussions, look at those little thumbs up features where students can vote a topic up. You can sort by likes. That way you could have students voting on what topic you're going to discuss in a synchronous session very easily. This is easy for students, just clicking on a few things that are interesting, it moves them up and you'll find they're interested in things you didn't know. Also, I don't know how emoticons are working for you in the various platforms you're using as a way for students to express total, I don't get it, versus hesitation. Zoom has made some filters available, I see, also sharing. Oh, I like it, Mandy, a one word or short phrase in the chat, pulling out some of the quieter students. It's a different environment. So students who were going to struggle might be struggling more, and students who weren't going to struggle might be struggling in different ways. And it's an environment in which inequity tends to amplify inequity, in which students who are first-generation college students or who have a learning disability or other factors are put in a situation that the system was not designed to support them for. And across the board, we talk about Zoom fatigue. Well, I think we have to recognize that whatever questions our students have or don't have, and that we need to anticipate and answer ourselves, are coming from those places, and just recognize the humanity behind everything.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Dan, you will have the last word.
Just a quick thought. I mean, one of the things we heard about earlier was negotiating with students a syllabus, but one thing we might want to think about is negotiating with students how to express reactions, and design a method that works for the particular class.
Right.
Absolutely, throwing that out there to the students and then trying to provide a way where everybody feels comfortable giving feedback on it.
I'm sorry, we're going to have to cut this short. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for this really
scintillating
conversation. And thank you all for joining us today. Please consider joining us again a week from Thursday as we continue the concept or addressing the issue of inclusion in our language courses.